So there's the soundtrack, the intro. Just kind of kidding around about that. It's a kind of funny one though. For lesson 6, gotta make sure you can hear me. And that's gonna be an abrupt end to the soundtrack. I'll have to try to figure out how to phase that out. But this should be your shortest lesson so far, lesson 6. First point is that the first declension nouns are distinguished by the following lexical entry. You've heard all this before, making sure you know it. It'll look like this: puella, puelli. There's the abbreviated form that you'll find in your book. Here's the full written out form that you do need to understand. That means that you see the nominative singular, that's the first entry, and the genitive singular, that's the second entry. Another example, regia regii from this chapter, regia regii, written out in full: superbia superbii and superbia superbii. That's what a word's going to look like in the dictionary. You need to understand that that is called the lexical entry, and that's what first declension nouns look like. The letter A is the sign of the first declension. They all have this letter A at the end of their words in the genitive form and in the nominative form. If you see the A-E in the genitive form in particular, that's the one single thing you can look at and know that that is a first declension noun, because it has the letter A at the end of the nominative and the end of the genitive, A-E for the genitive. And A is the first letter of the alphabet. That makes it nice and easy to remember that the ones with A in it are the first declension. There are no other subcategories of the first declension. You'll see why I bring this up, because in the second declension, the third declension, and all the other declensions, there are subcategories. But the first declension is very simple. They all look exactly the same. Once you've seen one kind of first declension, you've seen them all. Letter C says that most of these nouns are feminine in gender. A very few are masculine. In fact, we've got the full list right here: Agricola, Nauta, Pirata, and Poeta. Those are the 4 nouns of the first declension that happen to be masculine in gender. All the rest of the first declension nouns are feminine in gender. There are no neuters. These still have the characteristic A, A-E at their end, A, A-E for the first declension, but these are the 4 exceptions that happen to be masculine. And that's what you need to know about the first declension as far as finding it in the dictionary and knowing how to work it and use it for the rest of this class. Now to the second declension. The book finally gets into a full lesson on the second declension. The second declension nouns are distinguished by 4 different kinds of lexical entry. The book only gives you 3 of these. Eventually the book does introduce this type 3 I have right down here, but it doesn't do it in this chapter. I'm giving you the full amount of information because I think otherwise it can get confusing. There are a total of 4 different subcategories of the second declension. There are no subcategories for the first declension. It's very simple. That's why books teach that as the first type of noun form that you learn. When grammar teachers started teaching Latin, they taught the A declension first. They called it the first declension because it's the simplest. It's the first one that students learn. The second declension is pretty simple too. You'll see that the third, fourth, and fifth declensions are much more complicated than the first and second. But the second declension does get more complicated than the first. The second declension nouns are distinguished by 4 different kinds of subcategory, 4 different types that all fit under the heading of the second declension. The first type in the dictionary is going to look like amicus, amici. That is to say, it's going to end with a US in the nominative singular, and it's going to end with an I in the genitive singular. US and I that's a sign of one kind of second declension as opposed to the first declension that ends in A or AE. It's obviously easy to tell them apart. The second type is puer, pueri. It still ends in I for the genitive. Do you see how the second thing in the dictionary is the most important thing to look at? You've seen this with nouns, adjectives, and verbs so far. It's not the only important thing to look at, and it won't always be the most important thing to look at, but very often the second thing in the dictionary is actually the most important. You can see that the I is found in the genitive. The I is found in the genitive. Right here is an autocorrect. That should, of course, be an I, just like all the rest of them. So let's look real closely at this second declension. The first variety ends in US and I. There's a whole bunch of nouns in the dictionary that are going to look like this, and you have to recognize them as one variety of second declension. Then there's the kind that end in ER and I. Here's the full form. It's going to be puer, pueri, as opposed to amicus, amici. That's a second variety. The only way that they differ is in their nominatives. Instead of having a US, puer just has an ER. The third type at first looks exactly like the second type. I think this is why the book skips it. It's liber, libri, and when you look at it in its lexical entry like this, in the abbreviated form, you can't tell the difference. It looks like this ends in ER, and this ends in ER, and this ends in I, and this ends in I. You have to realize, and this will be written out for you in your textbook eventually, that the third type here drops that E in the genitive singular. It's spelled L-I-B-E-R in the nominative, but L-I-B-R-I in the genitive, and all the other forms. So the E drops out in this one, whereas in pueri, the E stays. So these are two different categories. This one has the E all the way throughout. Type 2 has the E in every single form, nominative, genitive, dative, accused, and ablative. Whereas in type 3, only the nominative has the E. All the rest follow the pattern of the genitive. L-I-B-R-O, L-I-B-R-U-M, L-I-B, etc. The genitive form is the nominative form is the only form that actually has the E. In all the rest of the forms, singular and plural, you drop the E out of that stem or root. So that's the third type of second declension. And then the fourth type changes altogether. It has UM followed by an I in the genitive. So instead of US like amicus, it has UM. And again, this was an autocorrect in my text. This should be an I right there. So it goes UM and I. Liber, libri goes ER and then I. Puer, pueri goes ER and then I, very similar to type 3. And then the first type, and the most common type actually, is amicus, amici, which goes US followed by I. What do they all have in common? They all have I in the genitive. Their nominative forms differ, but they all have an I in the genitive. Look at the second thing in the dictionary to determine the declension. If the second thing in the dictionary is AE, that's a first declension. If the second thing in the dictionary ends with the letter I, that's one of 4 different categories of second declension. It's that simple. You have to have this clear in your head right now so you can look things up in the dictionary properly and know how to decline something. You have to know whether it's first or second declension in order to decline it. Why do you have to know how to decline? You have to know how to decline in order to read sentences, and that's the point of this class, is to read real Latin and get the wisdom and the brilliance and the beauty and the information that the ancient literature has preserved for the last 2,000 years. So for the second declension, there are 4 types total. The first three types are masculine. The fourth type is neuter. Remember, for first declension, almost all of them are feminine, and there's 4 masculines. For second declension, the vast majority is masculine, but there's also a large group of neuters. All of the neuters will be type 4. The type 4, remember, end in um, followed by an I in the second part of the entry. Under this subcategory of the second declension, there are a total of 4 types, one like amicus, one like puer, one like liber, and one like templum. When you deal with adjectives, adjectives follow the pattern of amicus, for example, bonus, that's the masculine form, and the neuter form is bonum. So they follow the pattern of this first type of second declension and this fourth type of second declension. And then, of course, in the middle, the feminine form is bona, and that follows the pattern of a regular old first declension. Moving on to adjectives, you didn't see a lot of them in the last screencast or in the last lesson, so this is a good reminder for you. There are 2 declensions for adjectives. So far you know 2 declensions for nouns, but there are a total of 5, and there's only 2 different types or declensions of adjective. The only declension that you know so far, I call 2-1-2 adjectives. I call them 2-1-2 adjectives because if you look at letter B, the masculine form, bonus, is a second declension. The feminine form, bona, is a first declension. And the neuter form, bonum, is again a second declension. Can you see how bonus, the first one, is that type 1 second declension, like amicus, and bonum is that type 4 variety of the second declension. And then completely different than that, bona is just a plain old regular first declension. That's why I call them 2-1-2 adjectives. Eventually in this class you'll learn the third declension, and there's another type of adjective that follows the pattern of the third declension for the masculines, the third declension for the feminines, and the third declension for the neuters. Just so you understand what's coming up. There are 2 types of adjectives, 2 declensions. So far you only know the 2-1-2 varieties. So to be clear, 2-1-2 adjectives have the following lexical entry. This is how they look in the dictionary. They look like this: bonus, bona, bonum. That's how your book will print it. That's how most dictionaries will print it. Written out in full, it's the nominative, singular, masculine. It's the nominative, singular, feminine. And it's the nominative, singular, neuter. Adjectives have to be masculine, feminine, and neuter so that they can agree with the nouns they modify in their gender as well as their case and number. When you look at these 3 varieties, there's really nothing new to learn because bonus, the first variety, is just like amicus, a regular old second declension, the first variety, the first type of second declension. Bona is just like a regular old first declension. There are no types for first declension. They're all the same. So puella and bona are declined exactly the same. And then finally, bonum is like your model for the second declension. That's a neuter. That's that 4th type that I presented for you. Let's look at those types one more time just to make sure that we're clear on that. I've made the next point to you before, but it is crucial. It's always hard for beginning students to get this one. Happens in other Romance languages like Spanish and French and Portuguese and Romanian and Italian. Nonetheless, it doesn't always click with English speakers because it doesn't happen at all in English. The point is that nouns and adjectives must agree in their case ending, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, their number, singular and plural, as well as their gender, masculine, feminine, or neuter. The crucial part that is difficult for students, however, is that this does not mean that the words will always be spelled the same. Often they will be spelled the same, but not always. Here are some examples. These nouns and adjectives all agree in case number and gender, and they all happen to be spelled the same. Amicus bonus, both words are in the nominative, singular masculine. Amica bona, both words are in the nominative, singular feminine. Amicae boni, both words are in the genitive, singular feminine. Or they could be in the dative, singular feminine, same endings, or they could be in the nominative, plural feminine. But the point is they're spelled the same in this case. And donorum bonorum are both in the genitive, plural masculine, or perhaps in the genitive, plural neuter. You can't tell the difference without the context. But what you are trying to figure out or trying to realize here is that all of these have the same exact case number and gender, both the noun and the adjective. And these ones happen to be spelled the same. That is not always the case. Look at these two examples in letter B. In letter B, you have nauta bonus. As you learned earlier, the word nauta is one of the few words that happens to be masculine even though it's a first declension noun. So nauta bonus, both words are nominative, singular, and masculine, but they're not spelled the same. Nauta ends with an A, bonus ends with an us. And that's going back to this point here, that just because nouns and adjectives agree in case number and gender, that doesn't mean they're always going to be spelled the same. Here's another example. Pirate boni. These words are both in the nominative, plural, masculine, but they are not spelled the same. They don't have the same spelling. They do have the same case ending. They do have the same number, and they do have the same gender. As you get into more advanced sentences, you're going to have to figure out which adjective goes with which noun. And the way you do that is by trying to find the nouns and adjectives with the same case number and gender. So often they'll be spelled the same, but not always, and that always trips students up. So be aware of that point and learn your declensional endings so that it becomes easy for you to translate. And that really is the gist of the lesson. In addition to that, the text gives you in this chapter cardinal numbers. Cardinal numbers mean that they're the counting numbers. That's as opposed to the ordinal numbers. Okay, counting numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, etc. Whereas ordinal numbers would be first, second, third. Ordinal numbers put things in order. The counting numbers are called cardinal numbers. Cardinal numbers, the first cardinal number is unas, una, unum. You can tell right away that that's the same pattern as a 2-1-2 adjective, and of course the number 1 is a 2-1-2 adjective. It modifies a noun. You can say one girl, one boy, or one thing. So unas, una, unum is just a simple 2-1-2 adjective and is declined just like bonus, bona, bonum, just like all the other adjectives that you've seen so far, just like all the other nouns you've seen so far. The next one, you do not know how to decline yet. It's duo, duai, duo. That is declinable, but you haven't learned it yet, so don't worry about declining it. Same thing for number 3, trace, trace, tria. That's a declinable adjective. It's not a pattern that you've learned yet. Don't worry about it. Be able to recognize the nominative form, and that's enough for both of those. And then after that, the book gives you numbers up to 10, but none of them are declined. And it's not just that you haven't learned it. None of them are declined, period. The number 5 does not have an accusative case. The number 6 does not have a dative case. It does not have a genitive case. None of the numbers except for 1, 2, and 3 up to 10 are declined. Most of the numbers, in fact, aren't declined after 1, 2, and 3. There are very few exceptions. All you need to know for this chapter is that 1, 2, and 3 are declined, but you can only do 1 so far. If you were describing a boy, you would use unas because it's the masculine form. If you were describing any feminine noun, you would use una because that's the feminine form. And if you were describing a thing, you would use unam because it's the neuter form. And you would put it in the same case number and gender as the noun that it modifies. So those are the cardinal numbers, or the main information that you need to know about them. You need to memorize them in order to translate. The vocabulary is in the book. I'm not going to go over what the numbers are on this podcast. It's very simple. You just have to sit down, get yourself some Quizlet flashcards or some old-fashioned handmade flashcards and memorize those numbers. The numbers are not a major priority for this class, but they are pretty easy, so work on them, get them done, cross them off your list. The book is also going to start using Roman numerals a little bit. Many of you probably already know Roman numerals. I don't think, it's a priority for this class to know Roman numerals, but at least a brief familiarity will help you with the passages in the book. Roman numerals, here's the number 1, here's the symbol for 5, the symbol for 10, the symbol for 50, 100, 500, and 1,000. Those are the main symbols that you're going to come across in Roman numerals. The idea in making all the numbers that aren't listed there in between is to use the least amount of symbols as possible. So if you want to write the number 9, you don't just want to write 9 marks like this. If you want to write the number 503, you don't want to write 503 marks like this. The idea is to use as few symbols as possible, and there are rules, really just one rule that helps you maintain the efficiency of this system. What you use in your math classes, what you use in regular daily life are Arabic numerals, not Roman numerals. And the reason is that Roman numerals are not really that efficient. Even with the rule I'm about to show you, using Roman numerals to do advanced mathematics or balance your checkbook would be much more complicated than the system you currently use. So going back to the point that you want to use as few symbols as possible, you could write the number 4 by writing 4 slashes. And there are examples in Roman inscriptions where the number 4 is actually done by writing out 4 slashes. However, the more efficient way, when paper costs a lot of money, when inscribing things in stone requires efficient use of space, you want to maximize your use of symbols. You want to not waste your time writing out the number 1. So in order to avoid writing the number 4 like that, or any other long chains of 1s, you can subtract in order to be more efficient in the following way. When you put a single smaller number before a larger number, that single smaller number subtracts from the larger number. So here's an example. Before the symbol for 5, I've put in the symbol for 1. That means 1 minus 5, which equals 4. If you put the single letter X, which means 10, before the larger number, which means 50, that means you subtract, and so you have 40. And I know that isn't normal mathematical order right there. You would normally put 50 minus 10. That's not the way the Romans conceived of it, though. The smaller number before the bigger one yields 40. in this case. It yields the subtraction of the smaller from the larger. Look at this example, C and D. C is the smaller one, that's 100, and so you subtract that from the larger, which is 500, and then you end up with 400. Not the typical way you do it in modern, mathematics, but that's the Roman system. Look at this next example. Sorry, I put the writing back there. There we go. Bear with me if it happens again. Look at the next example. If you have a V, a smaller number, in front of a larger one, the 5, which is smaller than the 50, is going to be subtracted from the 50. So you're going to end up with 45. That's not the typical way to do it. You usually put the number that's immediately smaller than the symbol, but it's not impossible to put VL for 45. If the smaller symbol comes first, like a 1 before a 10 equals 9. A 1 before a 5 equals 4. If the smaller symbol comes first, it's a subtraction. If the smaller symbol is followed by, if a number is followed by something that is smaller than it, you add. So an X is a 10, and a 5 is smaller than the 10. If it comes to the right of it, you add. If it comes to the left of it, you subtract. So look at this example right here. X, 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 V. X, with an X following it, they're equal to each other, so you add them together. That equals 20. If you have 3 X's, they're all equal to each other. That equals 30. If you have an X followed by a smaller number, you add. That's 11. If you have an X followed by a V, the V is smaller than it, so you add. If the smaller number comes to the right, you add. If the smaller number comes to the left, you subtract. That's an awkward and strange way to write what you could just simply write as 5. But my point there is to illustrate, if the smaller number comes to the left, you subtract. If the smaller number comes to the right, you add. A few more quick examples. Here's the number 100. If it's followed by a smaller number, you would add. 100 plus x equals 110. If the x would come first, you would subtract. 100 minus 10 is 90. Here's another example. D is 500. If you put a smaller number in front of it, you subtract. If you put a smaller number after it, you add. If you are struggling with Roman numerals or you didn't follow this lesson that closely, don't worry about Roman numerals that much. That is the least of your concerns. Memorize your declensional endings, understand how to read the dictionary entries, the lexical entries for nouns of the first and second declension, know how to conjugate a verb in the present and the imperative present, understand your adjectives and your adjective lexical entries. And when you're done all of that and you have that perfect, then you can fool around with Roman numerals. Roman numerals are a very low priority in this class. Now, you may have difficulty translating a few passages if you don't know Roman numerals, but they will, over time in this class, fade away. They are not a major priority. I'm not saying to ignore them. I'm saying they're a relatively low priority in this class. I want you to be able to read Latin, not really deal with Roman numerals. Roman numerals are not in major use in daily life today, whereas if you understand Latin, you'll have a lot of benefits for your vocabulary, for your ability to read well, for your understanding of how other people write, not to mention you'll be able to have access to the ideas that have been preserved for 2,000 years. That's it. That's the whole lesson. I've posted up some answers on the website for previous chapters. I've graded, I think, most of your assignments. I'm coming close to most of your assignments now that you've handed in to me so far. You'll have another quiz coming up this week, I believe. I'll check the syllabus to confirm that. And other than that, I've had a few people Skype me. Please do that if you're having trouble or struggling. Latin is a very foreign language for you. Please give me your feedback and your comments on everything. And I also ask you to take a little poll to see if you would like to have tutoring for your online class. I hope many of you respond yes, because then we can justify hiring a tutor and you can have access to that person. That would be a free service that Valencia would offer to you. So please look into that survey and answer that so I can get valid feedback and justify hiring someone in addition to myself to help you with this course.